Governor Michael O. Leavitt served as Utah's chief executive from 1993 to 2003. His administration came at a pivotal time for the Beehive State as it won the bid for and hosted what have been called the most successful Olympic Games in history.
It was a moment I'll never forget.
Leavitt's visionary leadership helped him deal with rapidly evolving technology and societal forces that laid the foundation for Utah's remarkable economic expansion. In his new memoir, A Sacred Trust, Leavitt reflects on the significant efforts of his administration and shares valuable insights gained from his extensive public service career. Governor Leavitt, I'm so excited to be with you today and have a conversation about your memoirs. You've written this incredible book, A Sacred Trust. And I'm loving the title, and I know that a lot of thought went into that. What does it mean, a sacred trust?
Well, I think public service generally is exactly that. You have a large group of people who have placed faith and trust in the office holder. And I wanted that reflected. Mm-hmm. And I think the whole idea of this was born in me early. My father was in the legislature. And every year I would spend a week with him, shadowing him. Mm-hmm. But the deal was, if I was missing school, I had to write a report that would reflect what I had learned and what I observed. And I found that process of doing that both important to fulfill the requirement, but it was also useful to me. Mm-hmm. So I think at the conclusion of my public service, in the spirit of that same experience, I felt there was an obligation to write and to reflect the sense of trust that I felt.
A lot of what you've done here, you've put under the banner of past is prologue. Of course, a Shakespearean quote. And I'd love you to just kind of describe that, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a lesson from the past and then what does it mean for the future. So past is prologue. Well,
I have a long history with that phrase, some of which you will remember. Mm-hmm. When I was at the Department of Health and Human Services, I would every day go back and forth between the White House and HHS, sometimes multiple times. Mm-hmm. And at a stoplight on Pennsylvania Avenue, right behind the National Archives, there is a statue that contains that Shakespearean phrase, what is past is prologue. And each time I would travel that route, at the stoplight, I would turn and read it and think about it. And I observed over and over again that if we want to know the future, we can think about what's occurred in the past, because it does repeat itself. Now, I was writing to record my own thoughts, and I had written this volume where I had laid out the things that I thought were the most important changes that occurred during my service. And in the course of it, I realized we worked very hard to solve these problems, but they're all happening again. Mm-hmm. We had the Olympics. We're going to have the Olympics again. We build highways. It's time to build them again. Mm-hmm. We had a big population growth. The population is growing at a similar rate now. All of these problems tend to reoccur. And that phrase came back to me. Yeah. What is past is prologue. Yeah. I love the quote. If you remember, there's an ending to the quote. It references that what's to come is yours and my discharge, meaning we have the responsibility to take action. And I think it's a generational responsibility, as well as an individual responsibility. Not long ago, I was driving down Interstate 15, which we spent a lot of time expanding, and it was a big part of the work that was done during that period. And it was congested again, and I thought we fixed this, and then I realized we fixed it with a 15-year horizon, and it's been 18 years. Mm-hmm. And it dawned on me again that it is not just our duty to discharge, but now it's another generation's duty to discharge. So it's not just enough to know the past and that it will be reflected in the future. You have to have a resolve to make the changes that are appropriate when you are holding the baton. What's past is prologue. Our actions in the future matter. We're going to go through 6 major areas of the Leavitt administration where there were lessons learned and what we would call big gears
these items that leveraged additional actions. You pioneered this notion of the big gear metaphor, and it's used in public policy circles throughout our state. I want you to tell us, what is a big gear? Where did that come from?
A big gear is an issue that has cascading consequences. The metaphor was drawn from a large clock in the governor's residence that in a conversation with my daughter, how does this work? There were small gears that became progressively larger until there was a big gear at the top that actually turned the hands. Mm-hmm. And my daughter tried to turn the little gears, and she said, these are all stuck. I can't move them. I suggested she turn the big gear. And when she did, she said, oh, all the little ones spin. And so I think of these issues that have an effect on spinning all the gears in society as big gears. And in leadership, I think it's incumbent on leaders to identify the big gears and to turn them in a way that will make society work. All the little gears begin to spin.
All right, so transportation infrastructure. During the Leavitt administration, the rebuild of I-15 in Salt Lake County occurred. We started our first foray into rail transit. And there's got to be a lot of lessons learned for the next chapter of leaders in our state from all that you experienced in that transportation infrastructure leadership role. Let's talk through some of them. I know one of them that you bring out in your book is the imperative of innovation.
Well, problems are intractable because there's no easy way out. And when you're in a situation like that, you really need to innovate and do something different.
Take a risk.
Take a risk. Yeah. Now, in our case, we had the imperative of the Olympics. And the plan originally was we would have to repair over a 10-year period I-15, which was about a 17-mile stretch through the middle of Salt Lake County. Mm-hmm. Well, the thought that we would have I-15 torn up during the time the world came here was unacceptable. It would have been hurtful to commerce and to quality of life. It just wasn't going to work. And so I challenged Tom Warren, who was the head of the Department of Transportation, to find a different way to do this. And he came back with a very bold idea, which was for us to use a design-build concept, which was routinely used in buildings, but to use it for building highways.
Multi-billion-dollar project.
This was the biggest economic and political risk that I had ever faced. Mm-hmm. But we really didn't have a lot of good alternatives. And so in essence, we innovated the process. And what would have taken 10, 12, 15 years, we set out to do in 4. And it worked. Yeah. We were not only able to save hundreds of millions of dollars and a lot of inconvenience, but we also were able to do it in the time allotted so we could meet our objectives as a community.
So another terminology you use, and you've sort of referenced it, but it's this notion of back pressure, to take advantage of the back pressure in public policy work that can help you get things done. In highway building, I guess the Olympics was the major force of back pressure.
I found that back pressure is important in getting things done in lots of circumstances. This is a very good example. We had 7 years before the Olympics would be there. We had a 12 or 15-year problem, and we needed to find a way to do it more quickly, and it required us to take risks. And it was the alternative or lack of alternatives that caused us to really focus hard on solving the problem in a unique and different way. And I see that happen over and over again, is this existence of back pressure. It's one of the reasons I tell those who are planning the Olympics now, the benefit of the Olympics isn't the 17 or 18 days that the games are underway. The big opportunity is in the 10 years before, all the things you can get done in anticipation of it, and the 10 years after, where you can harvest what happened in the 10 years before. So this concept of back pressure, it's essential, in essence, a common pain, if you will. It gives everyone a stake in finding a solution, and motivation to do it and to do it well.
You and I have a colleague, LeVar Webb, who coined this phrase that every public policy success is a triumph of communications. I know in highway building that effective communication, because you were going to put the public out, right? They had to go through a lot of hardship because you were building in an accelerated way.
I would suggest it's not just the power, it's the imperative of communications. We were going to ask the public to do something very hard, to endure 4 or 5 years of inconvenience, and to spend a lot of money. So before we even proposed the project, we knew it was important for us to have them understand the problem we were trying to solve and to seek their input on how to solve it and what the end state should look like. And we did something that I don't know had ever been done before, and I'm not sure it's been done since, but we went to all the TV stations and all of the radio stations and all the news outlets and said to them, we have a problem as a community and we need to talk about it. And we'd like you to devote the better part of a week, in the case of television, we'd like you to black out all of the other programs on the air and carry this discussion about what we're going to do in our community. And they did it.
Yeah.
And we had a profound conversation as a community about what it would take to solve this problem. So when we asked them to pay additional gas tax, when we asked them to endure the payment of inconvenience, they were part of it.
Yeah.
Now, we also had to communicate through the process. They needed to have information. I often referred with my colleagues of when you're sitting on an airplane and things are a little bit slow, you like to hear from the pilot. People need to hear from us about what we're doing to solve these problems. I think I-15 was a triumph of innovation in highway building, but it was also a triumph in the way communication was used to bring that problem forward and to solve it.
So another area of focus in your memoirs and in the Past is Prologue series is the movement, the priority you made to have Utah become a tech capital. And there's a lot of incredible layers to this, but one of the most important is a decision that you made, a goal that you set for the state to double the number of engineers, computer science, and math majors in our state, to double them. And now, 20 years later, we're able to see that the doubling actually happened. And not only did that happen, but we saw engineering employment increase beyond the nation's 5-fold. We saw computer science employment in our state, surpass the nation's 2-fold. More than doubling of what the nation did, we did here in Utah. So this is an incredible, in my mind, success story of investing in human capital, seeing the future, where technology was taking us and how important it was going to be, and doing a role of government, meaning training, education, to meet the need. I'd love to hear you comment. Where did you get the idea? How did you execute on this?
This is an experience that teaches a lot of lessons. The first is, how did I come to understand what was required? It was, I went to visit tech leaders in Silicon Valley over and over and over again. And in doing so, I began to understand what they needed in order to make our state a tech capital. One particular conversation with John Warnock, who was the head of a company called Adobe, which is still, and is now a big part of our own state. I wanted them to come to Utah. He was a University of Utah graduate. I thought this will be a natural. And he kind of chewed me out. He said,
so you're in Silicon Valley, a governor, a tech leader, and he chews you out.
He said, look, you want me to come to Utah? I can't come to Utah. I'm a University of Utah graduate. I'd like to come to Utah, but until you have engineers, I can't come to Utah, and neither can any other tech leader. You've got to start investing in engineering, or you'll never be a tech capital, was the essence of what he said.
This is in 2000, 2001, somewhere
yes,
like that.
And I went back to Utah and thought, I need to find out if this is true. And it was true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We were not generating enough engineers that we could possibly represent ourselves as a tech capital.
Yeah. So a leadership lesson, go to the source, listen. Now something else really interesting happened here, and that is that, so the natural thing is, okay, let's go invest in our institutions of higher learning, but of course it starts a lot earlier than that, and this ecosystem of public ed and higher ed and those connections became very apparent to you.
That was the second lesson. I asked the question to my colleagues and to those in the state who had responsibility for this, what will it take for us to become a factory that will generate engineers and can populate our state with this kind of capability? And they pointed out, we can build our engineering school bigger, but we've got to have qualified students. And to have qualified students, there's some things we need to do with our curriculum. We need to increase the degree of math. We need to create a better coordination between our high schools and our colleges. We need to, they had a long list. And so I realized at that point, this initiative isn't simply about making the engineering schools bigger. We have to create an entire ecosystem that will support a tech capital. Now, education was part of it. We also needed to create the infrastructure within our community. We needed to have the law firms that knew how to build technology companies, accounting firms. We had to have people who could bring this about as an ecosystem.
Yeah. So I lived the Leavitt administration from the inside. I feel a connection to it. But when I read your memoirs, I learned things that I'd either forgotten or didn't realize. And so I just want to share a couple of those and get your reaction. One was that we were the second state in the nation to actually have a state website. So in the tech capital world, you're not only helping with the workforce to service a tech economy, but you're moving state government into the information age. You were the first gubernatorial administration to use email, just something that boggles the mind that at one point email didn't exist.
I think it's really hard for people, particularly younger people now, to
understand
how different things were, and it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And by the way, what is passed is Prologue. The same thing will happen with them. There will be new technologies that they'll be adapting to, and that's happening with AI. We're all going through the same experience we did around the year 2000 or in the late 1990s. We're going through it again with AI, and we're always having to adjust this way. This was the 1990s, and the internet was just beginning to be implemented, but you could see this was going to potentially change the way we deliver education, or the options we have to deliver education. The legislature was meeting in a joint session along with all the education leaders, and I was invited to speak to them, and I wanted to use that moment to paint a vision of what could happen with the internet. And so I wrote a speech which referenced my time as a paper boy in Cedar City, and how I got, I did it with an old-fashioned Schwinn bicycle, and then I got a 3-speed that had a shifter on it, and how much faster I could go and how much more effective it was. And I said, we need to be prepared to go from the old-fashioned Schwinn to the 3-speed with education. We need to find new ways and better ways to do it. We had before created 60,000 engineers. Time to do another one, and to create an entirely new group of people who understand and can be on the cutting edge of artificial intelligence. It may end up being the solution to another problem, or we may be dealing with our transportation issues, and we might want to be the place that can begin to pioneer the use of artificial intelligence in solving transportation issues. It could be any number of things, but the first thing is that we have to recognize that this is this generation's challenge, and that they, like the previous generation, will have to act.
Another important area of focus, public education. This is what state government puts the most money into, And, really we're talking about the development of people. What could be more important in our state? During your time, you had to deal with a lot of really interesting issues. And let's just start with something like choice in education. There's always this notion that people have different needs and that one size fits all recipe doesn't work. How did you deal with the movement to increase choice in public education?
I think there were several big lessons that I learned in working very hard at trying to improve public education. One is that it's important not just for education's sake. It's important for the health of our economy, but it's also important for the health of our people and our culture. So many of the things that challenge families and challenge people, particularly children, play out in public schools. You see children who come to school with issues that they can't solve at home, and it really is difficult for them to learn.
Right.
And so we have to be sensitive to the fact that public schools do play a significant role. However, I'm also of the view that public schools should be more of a menu of things that people can choose from, as opposed to a factory that people drive through and have to be treated the same way. I also became persuaded that we shouldn't be measuring just time. How much time do we have a student in a classroom? We ought to be measuring what that student's learning, and we ought to help them if they're not learning as quickly, or we ought to allow them to accelerate if they have the capability of doing so. I came to understand the absolute imperative of having skilled teachers and people who will devote themselves to the learning of our children. And they need to be paid well, because there are other industries that are competing for them. These are all lessons that you learn over time, but they're vitally important, not just to education, but to the success of our state generally.
So if we take some of those and think about the big gears for the future in education, it strikes me that our state is diversifying racially and ethnically in ways that we projected and they've played out. During your administration, about 1 in every 10 were a racial and ethnic minority. Today it's about 1 in every 4. And what makes that interesting is it creates a lot of different challenges for our educators. They have a lot of languages spoken at home. They have different barriers to how you interact with the cultures that in a multicultural society. What advice would you give to today's leaders as they deal with an increasingly rich level of racial and ethnic diversity, knowing that it creates some challenges because of the achievement gaps by race and ethnicity?
At the conclusion of my service, I offered advice to the next generation of leaders and told them I thought there were 3 keys that they needed to focus on. One was that the state was going to change demographically and hence culturally. We would have a lot more people who would come from other cultures and would settle in Utah, and that it was vital that we view them as a resource, and that we view them as a resource by helping them to understand and to develop the skills necessary to succeed here. And we're now seeing that play out. As you point out, when I was governor, 1 in 10 had an ethnic diverse background. Now it's almost 4, or will be. This is a problem that we should see as an opportunity. And our goal needs to be to help them be incorporated in this community and become assets in the community, and that can actually only happen through education.
Governor Leavitt, one of the greatest honors, I'm guessing, of your service was to be governor of the state of Utah during the 2002 Olympic Winter Games. Such a special moment. Opening ceremony, I think the viewing audience, was somewhere around 1.4 billion people all around the globe. Just reflect for a moment what good fortune that was to be governor at that time.
I have often said that 100 years from now, I'm not sure what will be considered the top 25 or 30 things that have happened in our history, but the 2002 Winter Olympic Games will be one of them. Mm-hmm. It truly did put the state of Utah on the map internationally. It taught us as a state that we could compete with the world and win. Almost every person in the state of Utah developed new skills, got better at things. And it was also a time of enormous unity. Mm-hmm. We had hard years getting from the announcement of the games being in Utah to the games. It will be for any state or country that prepares for the games. But in the final analysis, on the day the games were announced, the state was united. Everyone was at a television set or listening to the radio or pulled over to the side of the road. And when Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was the president of the Olympic Committee, said, the 2002 Winter Olympic Games will be held in the city of Salt Lake City, there was this explosion of excitement and unity because we were all unified at the same moment for the same thing. And that happened again as we concluded our preparation on opening night, opening ceremonies, when the President of the United States was there, leaders from around the world, the whole world focused on the state of Utah. The sky was blue. There was a dusting of snow on the hills. The Olympic rings on the hillside above the stadium. And then for 17 days, we executed our plan almost flawlessly. And the most profound discovery of the world was the Utah people and the spirit of volunteerism and service that they provided. I think that is what we illustrated and why Utah was over and over reflected as having presented an Olympic Games that were not only successful, but they were exemplary. And I'm sure that it has played heavily in the decision for the 2034 Games to be back in Utah again.
Yeah. So lots of just incredible outcomes from the Games, but it was not without its incredible challenges. And, 9/11 looms large, the Olympic bid scandal, all of these things that we had to get through. Tell us about what you learned about leadership during this time. You made some really difficult calls.
Well, I learned something about being governor, and I recognized that this to some degree, but it played out here. When we started our discussion, we talked about the title of the book as A Sacred Trust. I came to understand that trust wasn't just about constitutional or statutory authority that was given to a governor. It was about a willingness of the people to follow good leadership and a responsibility on the part of the person who occupies that role to step up and to say, this is the way we need to go at a moment when things were difficult and troublesome. And there were several points during the Olympic preparation and the execution of our plan for the Olympics that was required. And it was a sacred trust, and I'm so grateful that it worked out well. It worked out well because the people of Utah rose to the moment.
Governor Leavitt, another area of focus in your memoirs is human services, caring for those in need. And you helped lead as a senior person at the time in the Clinton administration, the Leavitt administration, welfare to work, welfare reform, the introduction of work requirements and the like for people who are receiving government assistance. What would you highlight from that experience? That's one of the last big times when there was like a big bipartisan change in our country for something in the human service area.
I, first of all, learned the value of understanding the way programs are carried out at the ground level when dealing with large-scale national policy. Typically, large-scale national policy is carried out by members of Congress. In this case, governors were invited and worked their way to the table to say, we want this program to change. It needs to change, but it needs to change in ways that are reflected on the ground in the way they actually are carried out. So the difference in what happened during that period was that governors were at the table writing the bill on how those policies would be carried out in the states. Welfare, human service programs are almost all administered by state governments, and they're almost always legislated at the national level, and that's a mistake. And so I learned the importance of governors being at the table to be able to bring a sense of rational purpose to the policies and the statutes.
Yeah.
Second thing
and you showed that states can make a difference. Yeah.
It was one of the few times in the course of the last quarter century when power and responsibility was actually sent from the federal government to the states, as opposed to the federal government taking more and more responsibility and having less and less ability to carry it out.
Yeah.
That will, I think, be an important conclusion there. I think a second thing I came to fully appreciate is that there are some things that you really need government to do. And without government, you'll have chaos and people will be hurt. And that's true in the context of human services. But I also again learned that it's better carried out by a government that's within driving distance, so to speak, where you have a sense of accountability.
What is the lesson learned from the creation of the Utah Department of Workforce Services?
Well, we had 29 different divisions and offices and departments, all serving in the context of how can we help people who have economic hardship. How can we help them get back to work? One of the important lessons I've learned about most of these issues is that they center around what do you think the role of government should be in a person's life. And in Utah, we concluded, we believed that a government's role should be to help people help themselves. And that we wanted to have a department, it was one place that people could go, and that our objective was to help them get back to work, to live in a self-reliant way. And that started with work. And it also was going to require that we gave them some help along the way. So if a mother needed to get back, they may need into the workforce for whatever reason, they may need job training. And if they're going to do that, they may have children and they need to have child care. And that they may have some time when they don't have income and we may need to supplement it in different ways. If they had to have 5 or 6 different people they were dealing with, it was both inconvenient and inefficient and wasn't very effective. And so we organized the Utah Department of Workforce Services with the idea of making an integration between the need to help those who have economic needs find their way back into self-sustaining and self-reliance.
Drawing from my economics background, Governor, I know that during your administration you had the most consecutive years of 3% or higher job growth. That's a big mark that we look at as economists. You had a lot of prosperity. It was a long expansion, both nationally and locally. And in the human service world, that's really interesting because it tells you that economic development is part of human services. Because when you have a strong economy, it makes everything easier.
Without the capacity for a society to remain prosperous, you lack the capacity to show the sense of compassion that you would like to as a state. That's part of the fabric of the state. They go very much together. We know that those who are employed live healthier lives. We know that those who find themselves lonely, that can be a deterrent to their health. We know that there are areas of our state that where the average age is substantially lower than in other areas. And so you ask, why is that the case? And it's because in some cases they have access to health care, they're employed, they have a family structure that they have access to health care. Mm-hmm. All of those things provide the basis of a healthy life. We refer to them as social determinants of health. So the whole picture has to be looked at, and how can you maintain a healthy community? And in many cases, it's not just providing the care they need, it's solving the problems. And it's not the state solving the problems, it's actually helping people solve their own issues in ways that will allow them to stay healthy and productive.
I think it's fair to say there's a mental health crisis going on in our country and in our state. Rates of depression, anxiety, suicide ideation. That's something that today's leaders have to wrestle with.
There is an epidemic in mental health, and I think we're learning that there are things we can look at that have been causing it, and hence we can change it. I'm struck by the statistics that begin in 2005 and between 2005 and 2010, this spike of mental health, particularly anxiety and depression. And it's there are those who point to the advent of digitization for people on social media and indicate that that's at least a corollary. I think it's more than a corollary. I think the evidence is becoming very strong that we have done some things that will rewire the brains of young people in a way that will make it difficult for them to succeed. And we need to learn from this and take aggressive action to change it.
Yeah, that period you mentioned, they talk about Instagram coming of age. They talk about the like buttons, the retweet buttons. They even talk about the front-facing camera. Really interesting, right? Because it's not just about the personal computer in our pocket, but it's about these changes that occurred in that computer that made us more self-focused.
It's this link between sociology, psychology, and technology. All three of those blend together, and I think it's also fascinating the patterns, for example, with young women. And that's a combination, not just of the phone, but it's of learning to understand human nature and the way human nature can be used to our advantage or to our disadvantage.
And one takeaway for me is it's not going to get any easier for our leaders. These challenges are very real.
They are very real, and they're unfolding as we speak. I've come to understand that there is a point in the life of almost every problem when it's big enough you can see it, but small enough you can still solve it. And this was certainly the sales tax on e-commerce was clearly going to become a bigger and bigger problem. At the time I began to look at it, it wasn't even a decimal point in the total sales. But if e-commerce took off as I thought it would, and as it clearly has, it could dramatically impact the capacity for state, local governments to do any of the things they have to do, whether it's building roads or having correctional and law enforcement or taking care of people in financial need or education. They were all dependent on being able to have a system that would collect taxes in a fair way. And so I felt like we needed to solve this problem.
Yeah. So you've got on your mind revenue sufficiency for the functions of state government.
And also fairness. I mean, I could see one distribution channel, that is to say, people who have bricks and mortar stores who are making big investments, who are employing people in our community, paying, or not paying, but collecting taxes, and then others who didn't, and they had an economic advantage. And tax policy needs to be fair. It needs to treat everyone the same. And yet there was this mind-numbing complexity. If you bought a product online, where did you buy it? who had the responsibility to collect it? Who had the responsibility to pay it? And if you take the number of cities and counties and states all having their own system, there was no way to solve this. And so there were those who were saying, well, it's just too difficult. We just need to not tax it at all. Well, then we ended up with a problem where we had to raise other taxes, which is never going to be a happy or a fair thing to do.
Yeah.
And so that was the nature of the problem, and it was clear that taking it on was going to be complicated and it proved to be true.
It was just having a level playing field for all retailers. Were you on the bleeding edge too much? Do you have any regrets about it? What's the lesson learned in being so ahead of things? Because in some ways it didn't get resolved till a few years after you left office.
Quite a few.
I know, I didn't want to.
Yeah. I think one lesson is that there are a lot of things in life that get done because there's a supply of people who don't know what they're getting themselves into. And that may have been the case here.
Yeah.
I could see an inequity, I could see a need, and I started down the path of thinking maybe we could find it. And I was occupying an important national role at that time as the chairman of the National Governors Association. It was going to affect everyone. I started sounding the alarm. As I sounded the alarm, people asked, we need to do something, could you do this? And I just found my way into it, and it occupied a lot of my time and energy, and I did, I do bear some scars as a result of it.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it took 15 years for it to play out, but when it did, it played out exactly the way we thought it could or would, and there's a solution on the table now. And so I look back on the things I accomplished. This is one of the accomplishments that people would least know about, but it's one I have a lot of satisfaction in because it really did change the way things work and made it better.
Growth and change is a dominant theme. What's the way to deal with change?
When we're facing change, and we are constantly facing change, there are really only three ways you can approach it. You can fight it and be eliminated. You can accept it and have a chance, or you can lead it and prosper. And I think Utah's ongoing prosperity has been a function of the fact that we have been willing to lead in change. There are risks, but the rewards are ongoing prosperity. My hope for our future is that we'll continue to lead, and if we do, we will prosper.